Hi, everybody. We are going to go over some of my oops notes today. These are things that I forgot to put in previous sets of notes or things that I said, but it was extra information, and not many of you found the importance of that to write it down. So, before the war started, 1935, Germany's going to do a couple of things that let us know that it is gearing up for something. The first thing it does is it withdrew from the League of Nations. It canceled the Versailles Treaty, and it began to rearm. So it started to build up its military. When this happens, Britain and France basically did nothing here. They adopted the swastika as the national flag, and they passed something called the Nuremberg Laws. These were laws that were specific to Jewish people. It said that Jewish people could not marry or have any type of sexual relations with Germans or Christians. Jews had to wear a yellow Star of David. They were expelled from government schools. They were fired from government jobs, and they were forbidden to own radios or public transportation. So if you can't use public transportation, you're basically stuck in your neighborhood. You can't go anywhere from there. And if you're forbidden to own radios, you don't hear on the news all the horrible lies that Hitler is having broadcast about Jewish people. And if you don't hear the lies, you can't come out and explain how they're wrong. Second thing Hitler does that lets us know that he's gearing up for something is he sends forces into the Spanish Civil War before the big World War II starts. Now, the Spanish was in the middle of a civil war. You have the democratic Spanish government fighting against the rebels who were fascists. And Hitler is going to side with and help the fascist rebel leader, Francisco Franco. Now, the real purpose here was to use Spain as a testing ground for new battle tactics based on speed and mobility, known as the Blitzkrieg. So Hitler knew he was going to use the Blitzkrieg, but he wanted to test it and kind of work out any kinks before he started World War II. Blitzkrieg is dependent on machines, so you're going to have tanks and armored cars. You're going to have that Panzer tank, means tiger. The German Air Force, the planes are known as the Luftwaffe. This is, all part of that Blitzkrieg, or that lightning war, that fast-paced war. Now, no country officially helped Spain, but you have lots of volunteers that join the democratic Spanish government from Britain, France, and the United States to fight against Franco. Ernest Hemingway, the American writer, he as one of the volunteers, and he ends up writing a book based on his experience in the Spanish Civil War called For Whom the Bell Tolls, which where he says no man is an island entire of itself. So basically he says all human beings or every human affects all of humanity. So if one human dies, even if it's the enemy, humanity is the less for it. Okay. These are what the Luftwaffe planes looked like. This is the Panzer tanks. They're a lot smaller than the World War I tanks. They're more heavily armored. They require a smaller crew. Remember that the purpose of the tank has changed. In World War I, the purpose of the Panzer tank was in World War II, the purpose of the tank was to transport troops across no man's land. There is no man's land in World War II. So in World War II, the purpose of the tank is to act as kind of a mobile cannon. So the Panzer tanks are smaller, they're lighter weight, they're more maneuverable. Then you have the Wehrmacht, which is the German foot soldiers. They're not going to be doing the bulk of the fighting. Remember, the Luftwaffe would bomb the enemy, then the Panzer tanks would go in and divide the forces, break up the enemy lines, and then the Wehrmacht would come in and fight whoever was left standing. As the Third Reich expanded, Jewish people and what Hitler considered other misfits were deported from whatever territories Hitler took over, and they were sent to concentration camps and ghettos back in Poland. In 1941, you're having a huge, massive number of people in these concentration camps, and Hitler allows Adolf Eichmann to institute what Eichmann called the final solution, what we know today as the Holocaust. So 1941, the first extermination death camp is opened. It's Auschwitz. The head of this guy is Dr. Joseph Mengele. He was known as the angel of death. He this is him. He did a lot of uh, experimentation on the prisoners at Auschwitz. Pseudoscience, trying to create a super soldier. Um, so these are some of the Jewish people trying to evacuate before the Germans come in. You've got this little boy carrying a wheel of cheese. Cheese was really smart to take with you because it lasts for almost ever. It's high in protein, it's high in calcium, it's high in fat, so those things will keep you alive longer. Plus, cheese goes bad from the outside in. So if it starts to mold, it's molding on the outside. You can just scrape that off, and the rest of the cheese is still fine. So it lasts a really long time. It's easily transportable. This is Mengele doing experiments. He liked to use twins for his experiments. He would experiment on one and leave the other twin alone, and then he would know whatever changes happened because of the experiment. You've got they did autopsies. They would. We'll talk about that one in class. I don't want to leave that picture up for too long. Um, this part's not on your notes. Hitler's going to divide France into two parts whenever he takes over France. He divides it into occupied France and Vichy France. Hitler takes France in 12 days. Right, World War One was years and years and years of fighting on France, and because of the Blitzkrieg, Hitler is able to take all of France in 12 days. Now, part of that is helped because there is a fascist organization in France that actually helps Hitler take France over. But occupied France is northern and western France. It is under direct German control, which means it will have Germans stationed in it for the rest of the war. And from 1940 all the way up through 45, whenever D Day happens, Germany is going to be working on a coastal defensive system they called the Atlantic Wall, which was used to set up landmines and machine gun nests to keep the Allies from bringing ground troops into France on the beaches. It's what made D Day so bad. Vichy France was southern France and parts of French North Africa. Hitler considered Vichy France an independent country allied with Germany because Vichy France was the part where most of the fascists lived, so they're going to support Hitler. Vichy France was headed by a man named Henri Pétain, who was a French World War I hero. Now, the Democratic side of France still has their own government, kind of. The French general Charles de Gaulle, he escapes France and goes to London and sets up what he called a free French movement. So he is basically operating a French government out of London. And all the Allies consider de Gaulle to be the head of France, even though he's not even in France and he has no control over what's going on there at the time. So what you see in blue on the map, that is Vichy France, and what you see in yellow is occupied France. All right, so a couple of pictures here. This is Parisians, Frenchmen from Paris, watching the German troops parade into Paris. They rolled in on trains. Here's Hitler. One of my favorite Hitler pictures, Hitler standing in front of the Eiffel Tower. We talked about the Blitz in class already. I just wanted to show you some pictures. Remember, it's the 24/7 bombing of London and other major cities in England by the Luftwaffe. It's just going to cause absolute devastation. You know, families are going to be torn apart. Whole neighborhoods will be destroyed to rubble. Schools had to dig bomb shelter trenches. The hope being that if a building collapsed during one of these, the steel beams would lay across the trench and the kids would still be safe under there and they could be dug out later. Just like they did in World War One, the adults are going to sleep in the subways because it's safer. And then they'll just get up and go to work again in the morning. If you've ever seen Chronicles of Narnia, most of the kids by this point had been shipped off like the kids in Narnia had. They took the children and they fostered them out to families in northern England because northern England wasn't getting bombed. This is St. Paul's Cathedral. It's a famous church in London. If you saw the wedding of Meghan Markle over the summer, This is where she got married. Part of the Blitzkrieg is there's a Blitzkrieg in the water too. Hitler's going to use submarines just like they were used in World War One, only instead of having submarines going out on their own and hunting, he has what he calls wolf packs, and they actually operated like a wolf pack. They went in and would go onto a convoy, our group of ships. They would pick off the ones on the edges and kind of uh, cut them off from the rest of the convoy, and then they would sink those ships, just like a wolf pack will pick out the weakest members of a herd. All right, so this part's not in your notes. This part right down here, 1939. Whenever Hitler invades Poland, we come up with a new neutrality act. All our neutrality acts before this said if you were at war, we cannot do business with you. When Hitler starts World War One, we create a new neutrality act that's known as the cash and carry policy. The U.S. can finally sell supplies to belligerents. A belligerent is any country that is fighting in a war. But the supplies we sell have to be paid for in cash and carried only on foreign ships. So this on paper we're neutral, right? Because we'll sell to anybody. But Germany can't pay cash, and Germany doesn't have a navy big enough to come and pick up the goods. So basically, we're helping the Allies without saying we're helping the Allies. 1940, when France falls, September of that year, we start the destroyers for bases deal. We trade. We give England 50 destroyers, which is a class of warship, and they give us access to different British naval bases around the world. So on paper, once again, we are still neutral because we're getting something out of it. We're not just giving to them. Also in September, the Tripartite Pact is signed, which is when Japan allies with Germany and Italy and becomes a member of the Axis powers. In 1940, FDR is the first president to ever win a third term. By the time of the election, by the time he's elected, 70% of Americans supported helping Britain, even if it meant we had to go to war. So by this point, FDR is going to get what he wants. We are going to get involved. March of 1941, the U.S. ended all isolationism when we replaced the cash and carry policy with the Lend-Lease Act. So we are choosing a side with the Lend-Lease Act, and the U.S. chooses the Allies. We would give England whatever supplies it needed, and we would carry them to England on our ships. In May of 1941, we started an undeclared naval war with Germany. We basically started sinking any German ship we could find. June of 1941, Hitler made his biggest mistake of World War II when he invaded the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union and Stalin, they followed their scorched earth policy, which we've talked about, until winter set in. And then the U.S. will eventually extend the Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union. I wanted to show you guys some pictures of what scorched earth actually looks like. This is the Battle of Stalingrad. And the Soviet Union actually allowed women to join the military. This is a female demolitions expert. She's blowing up train tracks so that Hitler can't put supplies or troops on a train and send them into the Soviet Union. Once again, it's not going to be easy fighting for the Germans, right? They're struggling through all of this. But the Soviets, they're pretty used to it, right? They are used to the fighting in the snow. July 1941, Japan is going to take over French Indochina. We call it Vietnam today, but they take over French Indochina, putting it in a position to attack the Philippines. When they are in a place where it would be easy for them to attack the Philippines, FDR responds by freezing all of Japanese assets in the United States and embargoing oil and scrap metal. At that time, when we embargo them, Admiral Yamamoto makes a prediction. Yamamoto is the Japanese head of the Japanese Navy, and he tells Tojo and he tells Hirohito, who is the emperor, that because Japan had limited resources, Japan could only manage to keep advancing and taking over territory for about 6 months. We knew that. They knew that. And so we knew they were going to attack us because their only play here is to be able to take out our Navy so that we can't enforce the embargo. If they take out our Navy, then people can still send them oil and scrap metal and they can keep going. Now, FDR prepared for an attack in the Pacific. We thought we were ready. MacArthur was assigned to the Philippines. He was sent there with his troops because we thought that's where they would attack. And to protect our Navy, our U.S. fleet was withdrawn to Pearl Harbor. Once again, because we assumed Japan would attack the Philippines. But instead, on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, at 7:55 a.m. local time, Japan, without declaring war against us, attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor. If you remember, there was actually a peace negotiation going on. There were peace talks happening in D.C. between America and Pearl Harbor, sorry, between America and Japan. That's how secret this attack was. Japan didn't tell its own people not to go to that meeting because they were about to attack us. Um, so some pictures of Pearl Harbor. All right, before Pearl Harbor, we have the Atlantic Charter, which defined the Allied goals for what would happen in a post war world. It's really similar to Wilson's 14 points. It was signed by FDR and by Churchill, and it's going to serve as the basis for the United Nations. Um, I know a lot of you wanted to see what Japanese internment camps looked like, so I wanted to show you those. Here's one that was in California. This is kind of the situations they were living in. FDR's military advisor was this guy. His name is George Marshall. The Tehran Conference in 1943 is the first one attended by Stalin. It's known as the first Big Three Conference. They set up the target for the next Allied invasion would be France, and then the conquest of the Balkans, which is Turkey and Greece and Albania, Romania, all of that would be left up to the Soviet Union. All right, so in September of 1944, Hitler ordered the use of what he called the V1 and V2 bombs. They were nicknamed buzz bombs. These are basically the beginnings of missiles. They're bombs you can aim. And now this whole war, part of Germany's strategy was called the big lie, which is you lie about stuff big enough, long enough, and people will start to believe you. So this whole war, Hitler's been talking about these amazing weapons he has, missiles and jet airplanes and atomic weapons. And we basically write it off as, yeah, whatever, big talk. He doesn't have any of it. Well, oh my Lord, in 1944, he had missiles. So people start to freak out. Well, does he have the other stuff he's talking about? And people have to find a way that we've got to get Germany before they use these other weapons. Which leads us into our own nuclear weapons program, which we talked about, the Manhattan Project. I just wanted to show you a couple of pictures of Oak Ridge as it was being built. Okay. We talked about how they would search you. It was actually a military area just to get in and out of Oak Ridge. So they would search all vehicles and all passengers. And then in and out of Oak Ridge, in and out of the plant, you'd see these billboards everywhere, right? Loose talk helps our enemy, right? Don't talk about what you do here. I love this one with the three monkeys. What you see here, what you do here, what you hear here. When you leave here, let it stay here. Okay? Don't go home and talk to your family about what you're doing. Even if all you do is push this button and pull this lever, that might be the one step Germany's missing. So don't tell anybody anything about what you do. We talked about this before. There are a lot of women who work in Oak Ridge. They actually looked for scientists who were married to women who had secretarial skills so that they could hire the wives to try to keep the population of Oak Ridge down. Los Alamos was Robert Oppenheimer's baby. It's in New Mexico. Oppenheimer is the guy in charge of the Manhattan Project, and it's his job to take all of the different pieces that are coming in and put the bombs together. I do not envy this guy right here, Captain O'Sullivan. It is his job to explain to a group of people who have never been taught the periodic table of elements, or what an atom is, or what an element is, or the theory of evolution, that there is a teeny tiny little bitty thing that you can't see even with the most powerful microscope, that has enough power in it that if you can break it open and release that power, it has an explosion big enough to kill 1 million people. He has to explain not only that that's possible, but how that works to a group of people from the government. So I don't envy him. Okay, and on the right, uh, is little boy exploding. Okay, over Hiroshima. Okay, 1944 election, FDR wins a fourth term. Okay. His vice president for this term only will be Truman, but by this point, his health is in very critical condition and he's going to die very quickly, and Truman's going to take over. The Yalta Conference happens in 1945. Okay. It's the last conference that FDR goes to, and they decide how they're going to divide Europe. They set up the division line so that the Soviet Union and Stalin end up in control of most of Eastern Europe. And in return for that, Stalin agrees to declare war against Japan, but not until 90 days after the surrender of Germany. In the Philippines, Leyte Gulf was the largest naval battle of the Pacific War. It crippled the Japanese Navy, and this is the first time Japan had used an organized use of kamikazes. So you have this is the U.S. Marines and Army members marching on to Leyte Gulf. This is MacArthur finally returning. Remember, he screamed, "I shall return" at the Philippines. This is him returning. He's getting off the Higgins boat and walking up onto the shore of the Philippines. This is a picture of a kamikaze plane right before it attacks a ship. Um, I just want to show you these pictures. This is the famous picture of the fighting on Iwo Jima. These are the Marines raising the flag on top of Mount Suribachi. Uh, Taking Iwo Jima was rough on us. We lost an aircraft carrier, the Princeton, east of Luzon, and it's always a big hit to your Navy when you lose an aircraft carrier. And I'll pick up with the rest in class.